This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on G7 summit and significance of Prime Minister's visit to Japan, Papua New Guinea and Australia. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, senior journalist.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is traveling to Hiroshima, Japan today to participate in the G7, the group of 7 most developed nations in the world, the G7 summit outreach, to which India has been invited as a guest country. This would be the first leg of the Prime Minister's 3-country visit. The G7 this time has chosen several key priorities as summit preferences in particular regarding their outreach with the invited guest countries. Among these is, of course, nuclear disarmament, which is extremely crucial as far as Japan is concerned, being the only country ever to have been at the receiving end of a nuclear weapon. The others are in economic resilience and economic security, regional issues, climate and energy issues, food security, and health and development. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa joins us to provide a perspective on why this visit and the meetings that the Prime Minister is scheduled to hold are so important. Good evening, Ambassador Wadhwa. Why is the Prime Minister's presence at the G7 summit outreach meeting so important?
I think this whole visit, first to the G7 summit and then after that to Papua New Guinea for a bilateral and the FIPIC summit, plus a bilateral with Australia there. If you take it all together, I think over these 6 days that the Prime Minister is away, he is going to be having around 40 engagements and is going to interact with over 24 world leaders in summits as well as bilateral meetings in this tour. That itself is something which is extremely important. And also we are expecting several deliverables out of the Quad summit this time in Hiroshima. Obviously the Quad summit was supposed to happen in Australia, but it's been shifted now to Hiroshima. Yet the deliverables remain, and we expect an important deliverable on cybersecurity between the Quad leaders to come out of this summit in particular. Now, of course, India is the current president of the G20. Japan is the current chair of the G7 grouping of advanced economies. And we've seen in March when Prime Minister Kishida was in India, he brought up the challenges before the global south, the issues which face them, and also how Japan and India could coordinate this particular agenda item to be discussed at both G20 as well as G7, and how there could be a comprehensive tackling of issues which confront the global south. So Prime Minister's visit to the G7 summit, his presence there, is obviously looked at with great expectation, where he is expected to talk about the global challenges such as food, fertilizer and energy security in particular, because these are what affect the global south the most. And besides that, India is also participating in 3 sessions of the summit. And the first one is on food, health, development and gender equality. Second will focus on issues pertaining to climate, energy, environment. And the third on peaceful, stable and a prosperous world. So in all these, India has a lot to say, a lot to contribute. The G20 process, which is on in India nowadays, has provided enough material and enough consensus for India to talk about these issues in the context of G7 and to see how the G7 leaders can take these consensus views of much larger community of nations into account when they discuss their own communique. Of course, the agenda, which is for the G7, which you spelled out very clearly, which includes nuclear disarmament, so close to the heart of Japan, but also, most importantly, developments in the Indo-Pacific region and how they can advance their vision for a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. In particular, Japan will be emphasizing on a common position in terms of the aggression of China in the Taiwan Straits, and the issue of Taiwan in particular, where some of the G7 leaders have differing views. So Japan will be trying hard to bridge those gaps and to bring about a consensus in views on this particular issue.
So there will also be clearly a lot of issues that the Prime Minister will not only be able to bring back to further elaborate on during the Indian G20 presidency, but there will also be certain perspectives which he will be able to offer to the G7 summiteers, depending on all of these aspects that you have spoken about, because each of them is something, as you rightly said, affect the global south very, very strongly. So, having clear supply chains going, food security, energy security, all of these issues, obviously in the context of what has happened in Ukraine. These things also likely to be coming up, the issue, the Ukraine war and the sort of stalemate situation that is emerging from there, causing so many problems globally.
Yes, the Ukraine conflict will definitely figure in a very big way as far as the G7 is concerned. This is an issue quite close to the heart of G7 countries in particular. All of them are concerned about it, and therefore it will occupy center stage along with the other issues that we have just spoken about. And of course, besides the free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan will be in particular very keen to explore the possibility of averting a similar situation in the Indo-Pacific by way of Chinese aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan. And we'll talk about the issue about what happens and how the G7 will respond if such a situation arises in the context of Taiwan. The problem of Ukraine and the future between the Europe and the G7 in particular will figure quite prominently during the discussions.
After Japan, for the second leg of his three-country visit, the Prime Minister will be visiting Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, and which will, other than the bilateral aspect, he will be co-chairing the third forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation, or the FIPIC summit, which, given the state of climate change and given how badly affected these island nations of the Pacific are, is not only very timely, but it is also, some of the outcomes are likely to be very, very significant. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes, I think the FIPIC summit comes after a gap because the first two summits were held in 2014 and 2015 in Fiji and in Jaipur. And after that, we've had a gap. But meanwhile, there have been a number of issues that India has been discussing bilaterally with the FIPIC countries. And here, India has not done too badly because we made consistent headway. In particular, what is important for the Pacific Island states is the issue of climate change. And it seems to be an existential crisis because of the creeping rise of the sea as far as these islands are concerned. They badly need climate mitigation. They need the means to cope with such challenges. And they also require considerable amount of help with expertise in many other fields of development. And it is here that the FIPIC summit becomes important. The fact that all 14 heads of state of the FIPIC island countries have agreed to join this meeting, the invitation of Prime Minister Modi, is very significant. Besides, its venue, which is Papua New Guinea, is also very significant. Papua New Guinea itself has been wooed a lot by the Chinese over the past few years and has made quite a bit of headway as far as Papua New Guinea is concerned, because when President Xi Jinping met Prime Minister Mahathir in Bangkok last year, he pursued a number of projects, quality belt and road cooperation to fields of agriculture, forestry, fisheries infrastructure, the special economic zones, disaster preparedness and mitigation, and green development. And all these areas are also those in which India has an interest and has a capability. But more importantly, India has an interest in the security relationship with Papua New Guinea. It has an interest in economic cooperation. Papua New Guinea is a country rich in minerals like gold and copper. India would like to cooperate with Papua New Guinea in agriculture and digital technologies in particular. And there is going to be a credit line which will be offered to Papua New Guinea during this visit, which will help take this relationship forward. But overall, I think the FIPIC island countries will be looking at development in terms of the livelihood issues, besides the climate change issues, and they will also look to India to provide the necessary wherewithal and the appropriate technologies, as I call it, in this regard. Because they do not need high technology, but they need the appropriate kind of technology which India has in terms of its areas like Kerala, for instance, where you have similar kinds of techniques and technologies which can be applied for the coconut industry, the coir industry, for example, healthcare, connectivity in terms of providing connectivity for providing healthcare by satellites, for instance, where India has made already a lot of headway with these countries. And these countries are very keen that this cooperation should continue going forward.
Prime Minister Modi's visit to these islands is not only extremely timely in terms of the overall Indo-Pacific outreach that all of Quad countries in particular and India are trying to achieve. It is really extremely important meeting, which people tend to sort of not look at that carefully because people say, oh, it's a bunch of islands in the Pacific, but their crucial strategic importance is phenomenal. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. It's a pity that President Biden could not pay this bilateral visit to Papua New Guinea and also not meet with the Pacific Island countries. He was also supposed to meet them along with this FIPIC summit that India is having. There was also a bilateral defense cooperation agreement on the card, which will now not be signed, will be put off till later, I suppose. But all this is very important because there's a ship rider agreement that has been negotiated and a defense cooperation agreement with Papua New Guinea between the US and Papua New Guinea. This was done during the visit of US National Security Council Indo-Pacific Coordinator, Campbell. So the Prime Minister's visit therefore assumes special significance now because China has started playing its game in the entire South Pacific while evidently focusing more on Papua New Guinea since Papua New Guinea seems to be the big boy in the group. And India, along with other members of the Quad, is now trying to do its bit to be more active there because an absence of there by all these countries has probably given a free hand to the Chinese. And also, the strategic location, coupled with increasing Chinese belligerence in the South China Sea and South Pacific, has sent a lot of alarm bells ringing in the Quad countries, India, Japan, Australia, US, besides that New Zealand. And therefore, the whole question of the vision of the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific is coming into question. And that is why this particular visit is so important.
After Port Moresby, Prime Minister visits Sydney to have primarily for a bilateral with the Australian Prime Minister Albanese. But he is also scheduled to have some very important meetings with the CEOs of various large Australian corporations. So clearly both the strategic as well as the economic aspects of the bilateral relationship being sought to be strengthened further. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, because that bilateral visit, of course, will give a chance to review what was discussed again in March when Prime Minister Albanese was in India by way of the economic cooperation between India and Australia and also give a fillip to the special comprehensive partnership that India and Australia have developed now. But besides that, as you rightly said, Prime Minister is meeting with the business leaders, the Australian CEOs, for a longish meeting for about 1.5 hours in the morning of May 23rd, after which he has specific meetings scheduled with people like Andrew Forrest, who's the executive chairman of Fortescue Future Industries, a mining baron, a meeting with Paul Schroeder, who's the CEO of Australian Super, which is invested into the infrastructure space in India, a meeting with Gina Reinhardt, who's the executive chairman of Hancock Prospecting, again, a big name in mining. And India and Australia are looking at a future of commodities where all these meetings become extremely important. They become important also in the context of the comprehensive economic partnership agreement that India and Australia are negotiating. And besides this emphasis, of course, the Prime Minister is going to address the Indian diaspora, which is very important in Australia. It's a growing number and now has reached more than 700,000. And some of the most important CEOs in Australian economy are now emerging from the Indian diaspora. So they are a bridge between this growing relationship between India and Australia. And at the same time, the meeting with Albanese is going to reinforce the growing relationship, the strategic comprehensive relationship between the two countries, building upon the vision of the free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific further.
Thank you very much for all of those perspectives, providing these perspectives on a visit that clearly is extremely crucial that the Prime Minister is undertaking.
You were listening to a discussion on G7 Summit and significance of Prime Minister's visit to Japan, Papua New Guinea and Australia. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, senior journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official.